Hey, Geoff, what would you say the difference between a language and a dialect is?
Uh, I have no idea, but I'm going to give it a stab here. I'm going to qualify this by saying that, I'm not a linguist at all. I do know some linguists, but that's a specialty that's very far beyond my expertise. But I would say broadly, the way I think about them is languages are wholly independent from each other in a lot of ways, right? So if you speak the English language, it will be different, and you don't speak the German language or the Spanish language, it's going to be hard for you to understand what those languages are.
Right.
A dialect, however, I think that there's a lot more crossover where if and I could even be wrong about whether this is actually a dialect or not, but if you're speaking American English, it's an American dialect versus the British English with the British dialect, that you can at least still understand each other, even though there's some words that aren't one for one match. How wrong am I?
No, that sounds really good to me, actually. And I think you're right that American English is probably a dialect of British English, and that there is some mutual intelligibility there.
Yeah. Now, that said, I cannot understand anybody who is speaking the Scottish dialect of English.
Sometimes it can be difficult to, even from within one's own country, to understand regional dialects can be pretty difficult. And a dialect, I learned through researching this episode, is not just pronunciation or grammar or syntax, but also vocabulary as well. So all of those differences can make a dialect. And
right, the difference between like a lift and an elevator, or
exactly perfect
chips and fries, that kind of stuff.
That's right. Those are great examples. So there is a famous response, though, that I want to read to you from a linguist named Max Weinrich. And he somewhat famously said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. Right. So the idea is that there's a lot of power in being able to call something a language, and what gets to be a language and what
which
gets
is
to be
so
a dialect could be more of a political power thing more than anything else.
I think, especially if you look back, like, I guess, to the world languages, and like historically, that absolutely has to be true, right? Like, there's a lot of languages that exist today that are probably less prominent, and it's because probably they were less militarily powerful or what have you.
Well,
they weren't able to.
If we're talking about English, London has had a huge role in developing English. In modern French, it's Parisian French, which has had a disproportionate role. So we're talking about very powerful cities. And so there's power and authority in being able to develop something and call that a language, and everything else that riffs off of it, the dialect.
Yeah. And what I was thinking of, and I know this episode is largely based around the English language, but was Spanish, and more particularly Castilian
That's right.
Spanish, which is a lot of what sort of, if we take a class here in high school, I think broadly what we're learning is Castilian. And I think there's maybe not so recent. I kind of remember that when I was going through school.
I mean, they might teach you the Castilian version, although I think in some cases you're learning, because we're in the Americas, you're learning Latin American.
Yeah.
And if you learn Vosotros or Ustedes, that sort of
exactly
lets you know what you're dealing with, right?
Yeah. And I think I think it just goes back to show like the power that's sort of behind the various countries that are able to promote a certain kind of language over, maybe others that aren't as powerful, or sort of regional dialects versions of that language, right?
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Well, so this episode is Geography is the English Language. And I think it would be interesting to get deeper into other languages. And we've talked a little bit about that to begin. But I thought it would be interesting for us to look at English, how it developed, how it spread to North America and through the United States in particular, because that's where we're broadcasting from. And then we'll head towards some regional dialects and some vocabulary that changes from place to place. So that's what I have in mind for this episode.
I think it's gonna be really fun. I mean, obviously, language impacts us all. Even if you don't speak English, I guess you probably wouldn't be listening to this podcast. But broadly, if you don't even speak English, this will be a very fascinating episode, because the English language is so prominent everywhere in the world. And I know there was definitely some butterfly effect style, history outcomes where that wasn't the case, right? And I think
But
there's
that's
even
true. English has only recently
yeah,
become sort of
very
the
recent.
language
Yeah,
of business and diplomacy. That was French for a while, and if we go
the
back
lingua
further in
franca.
time,
Yeah,
we find other languages that were prominent. And in researching this episode, I learned a lot of things about English I never knew. So hopefully, for people who are lifelong English speakers, which is many people, most people perhaps listening to this, that you'll learn something new about the language that you're listening to and that you speak on a daily basis.
yeah. So Hunter, take us through, I'm assuming, some history.
So, in the broadest sense, English is a member of something called the Indo-European language family. And so this would be a good time to get out a map or something, which we can't show you when we're talking, and you can see the distribution of language families. And you'll see that, this language family is a very broad categorization, and it includes lots of languages which have, you wouldn't necessarily associate with English, don't have too much shared vocabulary, sound very different. But in this way, English is related to most, but not all, of the languages in Europe and in Western Asia. And if we look at Europe, there's a lot of Indo-European languages there that stretch through the Indian subcontinent. Of course, not all of the languages in these places fall into this category, but this is the broadest way of talking about it. The parent tongue, or the Proto-Indo-European language, was spoken some 5,000 years ago. By nomads in the plains in what I believe is now Southeast Europe. So this, if you trace back all these different languages, there was a language that was the parent language to all of them from which they all stemmed. And I mean, this is very geographical because we're talking about the spread of language and the development of languages. When people start to migrate to different places and become isolated from each other for long enough, then there are changes in sounds, there's changes in grammar, there's changes in syntax, and there's changes in words. And eventually new languages form from which dialects will form as well.
Right. And I think broadly, as I think about languages, and again, correct me if I'm wrong in your research, but as I think about languages and let's say we go back to the age of, colonies popping up, in North America, there would be, a English colony that starts in Massachusetts, right? And at that time, they're speaking what is probably the exact same English that people in England were speaking. It's only a few months departed from when they left.
Right. But then after a while, and we'll track some of this, it starts to morph, it starts to change. And that's how a dialect forms. And if enough time goes by, that's how another language can form as well.
Right. Now, obviously, back then, there was still enough of a connection that
that's right.
A whole new language wasn't formed out of it. Yeah,
that's an important, that word connection is really important here because the constant sort of back and forth allows a language to be maintained, a dialect to be maintained. So if we want to break it down a little bit further, get a little bit more fine tooth definition on this, English is a West Germanic language.
Okay, I think I've heard that. Yeah.
Yep.
Or I've heard it's primarily Germanic, I guess.
Right. Yeah, it's a Germanic language, but there's basically West Germanic, North Germanic, and East Germanic languages. English is a West Germanic language along with German, modern Dutch, Flemish, which is a dialect of Dutch, although I lived in Belgium for a year and I kind of thought about it as its own language. So that's maybe the quote that we started with, that, people who speak that, they're like, no, we're not a dialect. This is a distinct language. So it might depend on who you ask. Also Frisian. So Frisian is the language, apparently the language most closely related to modern English, and it is spoken by inhabitants of Friesland, which is on the north part of the Netherlands, and also spoken in some of the islands off the west coast of Schleswig, Germany. So I'd heard that before, and I'm not sure if it's mutually intelligible, but in many ways, it's the closest language to English. Also, Icelandic is the living language closest to Old English. Right?
Oh, interesting.
So not modern English, but Old English. And this is just what my research has borne. Just a little bit on the other Germanic language groups. North Germanic language group includes Icelandic, Faroese, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish. And then the East Germanic language group is our extinct languages, which include Burgundian, Vandal, and Gothic. So these are languages that are basically extinct, that aren't spoken by groups of people anymore.
Now, I think, as you were talking about Dutch being closest to, or Frisian, which is they're based in the Netherlands, that sort of sparked something in my brain that I think at one point, as I was learning a different language, maybe it was when I was learning German, actually, that my teacher had said something to the fact that there are some sentences between English and Dutch that are kind of eerily similar. Now, obviously, they sound different because they have a different. They just make different sounds than we do in a lot of different ways. But if you were to like write them out, you could very clearly understand what the meaning is behind there. And I don't know exactly what those statements are, but I think that actually tracks pretty well to what you just said.
Yeah, no, I found that to be the case. Yeah. Living in Brussels, I was living with a French-speaking family learning French, but and I know that you did a YouTube episode on this, and maybe we can do a podcast on the linguistic differences of Belgium, which would be fascinating, I think. But when somebody would, ask a question, a short question or something like that, I'm like, wow, that sounds almost just like English. I think I know what you're asking.
Yeah.
So it's the English sounds and grammar that make it a Germanic language. However, apparently some 2/3 of the English words, the English vocabulary words, are Romance or italic words. So words that have their origin in Latin or French or Spanish or Italian. And about 1/4 of the vocab is Germanic, similar to what you would see in contemporary German. So it's interesting. It's a Germanic language, but one in which a lot of the vocab comes from another language group.
Interesting. So we're dominant Germanic sound, but dominant
and
words
grammar. Yep.
From Romance languages like French or Italian.
As I was doing this research, I quickly came across a bunch of terms which I didn't, and it gets really deep into some kinds of changes that you almost have to have studied some linguistics to understand. So I'm not going to, if you're a linguist listening to this, you might say, wow, this is a pretty soft treatment of what's going on. But this is for the generalist here. And I'm trying to bring that to folks who don't necessarily have a deep understanding of linguistics. And I'll do my best. It's interesting that certain words in English certain categories of words come from certain areas. So many scientific words, for example, come from Greek.
Okay, that tracks.
Well, that tracks, right? Mm-hmm. Many words from fashion, cuisine, politics, diplomacy, drama, literature, art, and ballet come from French. Not all of them, but many of them.
Also tracks. Yeah.
Right. And French words have been working their way into the English language from the time that English was developing in what is now Great Britain, but also subsequently working their way into the language when English came to North America. So there's different eras of this impact. Some nautical terms in particular come from Dutch. And then and this won't be surprising to anybody who studies music, is that many musical terms come from Italian. So arpeggio, this kind of stuff. If you're reading musical notation, all of a sudden you're reading Italian, actually.
Yeah, it's funny. As you're saying each one of these, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I can almost think of the words like right off the bat. Like, yeah, obviously that sounds and looks like it would come from France, or that one sounds like it would come from Italian.
Right. Even the word
like
cuisine,
none of this is surprising.
Yeah,
but it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Like
it's
you don't think about
it. You don't know that you know it, and then somebody points it out. You're like, yeah, I know that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So apparently English has words from over 300 or as many as 350 different languages. Some of this was probably formative when English was getting going. A lot of it probably has to do also with the fact that the British had a huge global empire. And as people were traveling or taking over different parts of the world, some of the language, some of the vocabulary worked its way back into English.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, can I give you some examples?
Absolutely.
From different parts in the world.
Let's go for it.
So, words from English that originated in Hindi include shampoo, pajamas, juggernaut, and jungle. Apparently,
interesting.
Tamil, the words pariah and curry come from Tamil. Welsh, the words for flannel, which is not 100% shocking, but then penguin also apparently
penguin
are from Welsh. Gull is a Cornish word. We have a bunch of words from Gaelic and Irish, some of them not shocking, probably. Shamrock, leprechaun, galore, hooligan, clan, plaid, and whiskey all come from Gaelic and Irish. We have Persian words in the English language, which include paradise, lilac, bazaar, chess, and salamander. Words that we get from Norwegian in English include ski and a budsman. The word for sauna is Finnish.
Mm-hmm.
We get words from Russian, including mammoth, troika, and vodka. And then the word tundra comes from Russian, but originally comes from Sami, which is the indigenous group in the northern part of Scandinavia and Russia. The word robot apparently stems from Czech. Uh, ketchup is apparently Chinese in origin. There might be some multiple origins from some of these things. From Japanese, we get tsunami, karate, tycoon, and kabuki, some words that you might expect. From Malay, we get bamboo and orangutan. From Aboriginal Australian, boomerang. From Tongan, taboo. From Tahitian, from Tahitian, tattoo. The word chimpanzee comes from Congo.
Mm-hmm.
The Bantu language gives us the term gumbo. The Inuit, which are the indigenous people of the North American Arctic region, kayak and igloo. The Algonquin term, and there are lots of terms from various Native American groups in English now. Totem is one of those. From Nahuatl, we get mezcal. From Portuguese, back to the Latinic and Romance languages, marmalade, flamingo, and molasses. And from Basque, and it's interesting, Basque is a language that linguists are unable to tie to any other language.
I've heard that, yeah.
We get the word bizarre. So that's just a sampling of some of the vocabulary that many of us use pretty frequently that have all come from very different places in the world.
I think my takeaway here is that the English language is kind of the hodgepodge language. And I'm sure every language absorbs words in some respects.
I think that's true. I think some of them guard against that more than others.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
I think,
know,
as
like
you're
French,
suggesting, English has been kind of willing, perhaps, in a way, to absorb.
Right. Yeah, I know. For example, French is very, very guarded. I have a friend who is from France, and they teach very specific words, and they will create new words to basically circumvent an English word, for example, becoming the dominant word. So they will sort of create a new word for that.
That's exactly right. There's something called the Académie Française, which is I think a government institute that tries to regulate language and vocab. Yeah. So they don't like le weekend, it's fin de semaine.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like, if you remember what a Walkman is, perhaps I'm dating myself a little bit. Like there was a term, le Walkman. Apparently they like le balador instead. So, guarding against incursions from English in particular, but there's no no
like
equivalent to that, particularly in American English. There's no group that, it's more those who are writing textbooks and dictionaries that have a lot of power in this, but some languages have, government agencies that are trying to protect the language. That's not true in English. So English, this will shock no one, is the dominant language, but far from the only language in a number of places in the world. The United States, of which there are more English speakers, I think, than anywhere outside of possibly India. The United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, several island countries in the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean, English is the dominant language. Now, in some places, English, so the United States, do you know what the official language in the United States is, Geoff?
Yeah, we don't have one, right?
We don't have
that's
one.
What I heard, right? It's like
different states get to choose.
Yeah,
what it is, and I think more than half of them have English as an official language, but many have no official language. There's one state that I know of that has two official languages.
I'm going to guess Hawaii has Hawaiian.
That is correct. You are absolutely correct. Yeah, that's right.
I'm going to guess the second one would be English.
English and Hawaiian are the official languages of Hawaii, as far as I know. English is an official language in India, in the Philippines, in Singapore, and in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including South Africa. So English is diffuse.
Yeah,
in lots of different places.
I just recently saw a infographic that basically outlined sort of the most spoken languages in the world. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but it separated them out by native and by non-native. So it was like, it combined them all into one. So it was like English was the most spoken language in the world by total. Right. However, if you just take native speakers, it would be like fourth or something like that. It'd be down the list quite a bit.
It would be Mandarin or something that would be number one.
I think, yeah. And I'm trying to remember, I think Mandarin was number 3. I think Spanish was number 2. But I think there's some...
by that list, right.
Yeah, by that list. Yeah.
By total number of speakers, not what they call native speakers. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very interesting, though.
How are we on time? Can we keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going for another couple minutes, or actually, is this a good time for an
Yeah,
ad break?
I think there's a natural break moment here, and we'll sort of loosen up. And when we come back,
Okay.
we'll talk about how English really starts to spread through what is now Great Britain.
Okay, well, let's do a quick ad break, and we will be right back.
And we're back. We're talking about geography is the English language, and we've talked a little bit about some of the vocabulary and influences from other places. But let's speak a little bit now about how English gets formed and how it changes. And Geoff, you've heard of Old English before,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
thous and it's kind of like Shakespeare, right? Like
Actually,
wherefores.
Shakespeare is a little bit more
Oh,
contemporary. Old English is way
I guess
before
older
Shakespeare.
English.
Older English, like old English,
Yeah,
right? So we're
old
talking
English. Okay.
about um, English is Old English is what was forming in Britain in the 5th to 7th centuries, Common
Okay,
Era or AD,
very old. Yeah.
right? So that's pretty old. By Anglo-Saxon migrants from what is now northwest Germany, southern Denmark, and the Netherlands. So where those countries are now, Anglo-Saxon migrants came to what is now England, to Great Britain as well, and started to displace some of the Celtic languages that used to dominate in that region. Now, of course, the Celtic languages endured in some parts of the area, and particularly in Scotland, Wales, and in Cornwall, which is in the southwest of England.
So,
And so
really quick.
yeah.
So if Old English got its start from Anglo-Saxon peoples who were from Germany, the Dutch, and Denmark, I think you said.
Yep.
Then this Old English language is probably pretty close to German, I would imagine.
Yeah,
or,
I mean,
or whatever, or Old German, or whatever they were speaking at that time,
that's probably the case.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to look at some of that history of the German language as well, or some of the West Germanic languages. And we saw that the Proto-Indo-European language was further southeast and then spread into various trajectories into the Indian subcontinent, into Europe. But yeah, it's interesting to see it would be interesting to learn when some of these languages diverge from one another.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So this Anglo-Saxon language is Old English. And then the introduction of Christianity into the area is what starts to bring some of the Latin words into Old English. And apparently, and what I have from my notes, and I don't have this fully vetted here, but I'll say it just in case it might be true, that the Latin alphabet, which we use still, was introduced by Irish missionaries in the 8th century.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. I did not know.
Right? So that's an interesting trajectory that we might not have been thinking about. In the 8th and 9th centuries, there was conquest in different parts of what is now the United Kingdom from Scandinavian Vikings who brought the influence of the Old Norse language. And I think there's debates within the linguistic community, the linguistic scholars, as to how big an imprint this had. But apparently the Old Norse language did have an impact on English at this time.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Anytime there's a invading force, I think, especially during this time, right? Like, I'm assuming those communities integrated and then it probably just adapted and, words became part of the language, just like
things start to change.
Yeah. Right? I mean, I think that's the history of English just seems to be boiling down to, and now there's other words being injected into it.
And I mean, this is power, right? When a new power comes in and has the ability to change things and to, one of the major aspects of a culture is a language. That these waves of different influences, relate to these incursions of other people bringing the new language and something new coming out of it, a new syncretic language, a new change. So this bridges into what we call Middle English. And so if we think back to 1066, which was the Norman conquest, which predicated the decline of Anglo-Saxon Old English and spurred the rise of the Anglo-Norman era and the rise of something called Middle English. Now, Norman was a Romance language that was derived from Latin, which itself was influenced previously by Old Norse, because the Vikings had invaded what is now France as well. So Old Norse may have an impact on the Anglo-Saxon side of things, but on the Norman side, of things as well. And so we start to get more changes. And apparently the language undergoes very big changes during this period of time. And that this is the English that's spoken roughly through the late 15th century.
Okay, so now we're getting back.
Pretty
now
good
we're getting pretty close to like Shakespeare.
We're getting closer to Shakespeare,
right?
Yeah, Shakespeare, I think, is the early form of modern English, right? Okay. Which is why we can still read it.
Which is why we can still read it, and like I
think
understand
it.
Maybe we're gonna get to this in some point, but I think Shakespeare, is at least theorized to have been responsible for a number of our modern words.
Yeah,
I've heard something similar to that. Yeah,
I think what we're talking about is once something's either written or repeated over and over again, it becomes standardized. And I mean, we can look at words made up by Lewis Carroll, for example, that were completely made up that are now actual words in the English language because it was written down and that work had enough staying power where that became part of the language. So the early modern English period begins around 1500. There's something which I'm not sure I understand completely called the Great Vowel Shift, which characterizes this period, which is the shift in pronunciation of long vowels. So you get a very big shift in the pronunciation of words with the emergence of modern English. And then you get the incorporation of many Latin, ancient Greek, French, German, and Dutch words as well. So the vocabulary starts to shift and probably some pronunciation because of that as well. Apparently, there are also very big changes in pronunciation at this time. And this is further amplified by the spread of the London dialect, which becomes increasingly influential in the way that people speak in other areas as well. And then, as we just sort of mentioned, the standardizing influence of printing, of the printing press. And we'd always talked about doing, what if there had been no printing press? And we're starting to get some of our answers right here, is it's what helps standardize languages, and English being one of those.
Yeah, I think technology, and maybe we're going to get to this at some point as well, as I just sort of, vamp here a little bit. But technology, I think, absolutely it is standardized language to, I think, a degree that has never been able to have been achieved. And I'm talking like, internet now and like.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah. Like, again, I don't know this. I'm not a linguist. I'm not tracking the dialects between, teenagers in London versus teenagers in New York. But I would imagine because of the likes of videos going popular on things like TikTok or Instagram, that there is now more crossover in sort of the slang that they're using than they would have been maybe even in like the 70s or 80s
when they weren't. That's the case.
When they weren't able to talk.
That's right.
So I think the printing press was sort of the first. Well, maybe not the first, but maybe the first major technological institution that enabled this standardization across time and space. Right.
I mean, and it also necessitates the need to standardize a language, because if you are starting to write and print things, then you're going to want to have a standard for that, which was less of an imperative when people are living apart from each other and speaking dialects from one another. I mean, obviously, there's a need to understand one another through diplomacy and through trade and these kinds of things. But certainly the printing press obviously has a big role. And as you said, the role of the internet today probably is having a really big impact in the spread of language and words and expressions and things like that.
Yeah, and I do wonder, and maybe you have this answer somewhere, but I do wonder, as we're talking about the printing press, the United States is such a vast country. It really became sort of whole and sort of what we know today, sometime around the mid 1800s, when it sort of acquired or took all of its land. But despite its vastness, there's not nearly as many, regional dialects or accents even that you might expect, as compared to England, which you can go 20 miles outside of London and hear a wildly different accent.
I think that's the case. I do
wonder if that's because of, well, first the printing press back in the 17 and early 1800s, and obviously now modern day technology, that the language just was never able to evolve because nobody was ever that isolated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, certainly the history of English in the United States is fairly recent compared to the history of English in the UK. And so that probably accounts for it as well. But, and as we know, there are different accents and different dialects in American English, which sometimes make it hard for people from different parts of the country to understand each other particularly well. I know that I'm from the Northeast originally, and I tend to speak quickly because this is what we do in the Northeast. And when I'm teaching a class, I have to sometimes I talk out loud about this and say, I'm going to try to talk slower now because I know that might be helpful. And people are nodding their heads. Yes, please do that. And so that's just one of the things, that the speed at which one speaks has an influence in the way one can be understood as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I know people from the Northeast speak fast. I think I speak pretty fast, as I hear myself on these podcasts. But I do know, for example, people in, maybe the South speak a little bit slower, a little bit more drawn out. All their words are elongated just a little bit more. So everything's maybe even a little bit more flowy than the rapid fire of somebody from the North,
maybe the coasts or something like that. Yeah.
Or something like that. Yeah.
No, I think that's the case. And as we go through this episode, when we start talking about dialects more and more, we're going to be focusing on vocabulary. Okay. One, because I'm not really qualified to say things like people who live in other parts of the English speaking world say things. And so and I don't, it can easily be construed as making fun of somebody or something like that. And that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand how a language changes, how it morphs, how it diffuses over time. So that's why we're hooking on a vocabulary a little bit, but certainly the sounds can be very different in the way that vowels are said. And as you said, if they're drawn out or said quickly, can have a huge impact. And, if you speak other languages, sometimes there are dialects that are easier and harder to understand based on something like the speed at which somebody speaks.
Exactly. Yeah.
So modern English, again, as we said, if you've read Shakespeare, you're engaging with an earlier form of modern English. And then you talked about technology. It's the role of industrialization that also has a pretty big impact in the development of modern English. The Industrial Revolution, in addition to connecting different places, also introduces a whole new sets of vocabulary for new inventions that maybe are different. You mentioned lift and elevator. Elevator, we talked on a previous episode, nice tie-in to the skyscraper episode, and the Otis company and Otis, who invented the elevator. Elevator is used in the United States where that innovation, not the earliest form of a lift, but a contemporary elevator was invented, and we use that. But lift is used in many other parts of the English-speaking world to describe the same thing. So English colonialism, we've already spoken about, spreads English across many parts of the world, and at this time is absorbing words from various languages across the world as well. English dialects then develop not only in various countries, but in different parts of different countries as well.
And I do wonder, as English is spreading around the world through colonialism, largely propagated, though not solely, by the British Empire, that if the English language was so rigid in how it was absorbing words or whatnot, whether it would have been as adaptable to a lot of the places that ultimately do take it on as a second language, such as India, such as wherever, such as Singapore, all these different places, right? Like, would that have been a stopping factor for the language to grow the way it has?
Yeah, I mean, there's the influence.
It's a good question. I don't have the answer, but
I think it's a great question because there's the influence of colonialism, which is direct territorial control of another place and another group of people. But then there's also the huge overseas business network that was the English Empire as well. And there's there's interactions with people speaking different languages through business as well. And sometimes business, you're going to adapt if that's going to be conducive to conducting trade. So there's different trajectories based on different activities of English imperial power, really.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think we are about due for a quick ad break here.
Okay. All right.
So let's go ahead and do that. And then I think we'll start to wrap this up and sort of head to our final segment here on.
Yeah, there's a bit more to say here, but we're going to be taking the story even more squarely to the United States upon our
All right. Yeah. America Ho, here we come.
And we're back talking about geography is the English language. And we've taken the story to English colonialism, English imperialism, and the wave of English speaking colonists who arrived in North America in the early 17th century. One note that I found from my research is that the English dialects that came to the United States weren't necessarily from the wealthiest class of English speakers. And so already, which dialect of a language comes to a different part of the world has a lot to do with the trajectory of that new language. So that's apparently significant. Here's another thing that I found very interesting, and apparently this is true, is that British English has apparently changed more since 1600 than US English.
That is it. Well, so that
maybe that holds up with what we were talking about before, though.
Yeah, yeah. So if I can theorize on this a little bit, so I maybe just expand on what I was talking about earlier with, when I was talking about the printing press and maybe how and why the United States doesn't have very many dialects or even very many different accents that are audibly different. I gotta think it has something to do with that. Just in the United States came around at a time where there was already an established way of speaking, and as newspapers were flowing out, or somebody would move to another city and start up a newspaper, they would start with that language already. And as you're putting things,
gets replicated.
It gets replicated, right? As your papers are coming out, every day. And I'm just using newspapers as an example here. I'm sure there's a lot of different other examples, but there's a need to have something that is consistent and coming out, at a relatively consistent pace and style. And while I think you can probably say the same thing was happening in England, right? Obviously, the printing press was around and there was probably still that need for consistency. Maybe it's just they had such a history of adapting and changing their languages to whatever they needed. And maybe it was even, maybe regional pride a little bit to have your own language and say your own words in a specific way. I can see all of this sort of flowing into an answer to why British English has changed so much more than American English over the last 400 years.
Well, they've had this trajectory of different dialects before mass communication.
Right.
And that probably has a lot to do with it. And that the United States, when it becomes a country, mass communication, although it's not what we have today, is already sort of a phenomenon.
Yeah, now, I would say what they had then is closer to what we have today than, what England had in 1700s to what England had in the year 1000.
The other thing that I came across in my research is that contemporary American English is probably closer to early modern English than contemporary British English. And this goes along with this, the slower pace of change maybe happening here. But that's a very interesting thing to consider. Of course, we have to talk about that. The spread of English in North America comes at a terrible expense of languages and territories of Native American First Nations people in Canada. And so, this is part of the story as well, and that there's the displacement, and in some cases, languages that have become lost because of the colonization by the European powers and then subsequently the United States itself. So that's something important for us.
Yeah, thousands of languages lost.
That's right. So now some of those words, some words, as we've talked about before, are integrated from, the first peoples, Native Americans, to the English language. But then with every wave of immigration that comes from different part of the world, and initially there were a lot from Europe during industrialization, you get accelerated changes in language and a lot of additions to vocabulary that come from that. So those are some of the influences that do account for some of the change that is happening in North America, in the United States. Waves of immigration, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, into the 20th century as well. And then something else that has a really big impact, and we've touched on this a little bit as well, is that the widespread adoption of a particular dictionary, and can you guess which one I'm thinking of?
Webster's.
It is Noah Webster. That's right. It's Noah Webster's dictionary, which became really the favored one. And I think it's in the early 1800s when the first edition of this comes out. I've seen different dates for when that first came out. But there was another more British focused dictionary by Nathaniel Worcester. And we don't talk about Worcester's dictionary. We talk about Webster's dictionary. And Webster's dictionary is the one that more favored the new vernacular of American words. So the role of Webster's dictionary in standardizing English and creating kind of an American dialect is really important to note. It's at this time that there's many spelling changes in Webster's dictionary. So color, C-O-L-O-R, instead of C-O-L-O-U-R. Center, where there's no E at the end, as opposed to having an E at the end like you would in British English. So we get some of these things that we're still sort of experiencing as differences between American and British English come about with this change.
Well, and Webster's dictionary, I mean, they do this even to this day, where I think it's once a year they have sort of like their word of the year, where they basically they find a word that's being used in popular culture, and they sort of integrate it into their dictionary. And it's something, it could be all kinds of words that are just sort of popular. I think LOL was one of them at one point.
That's right.
And that obviously started.
I think they choose one, but that's as a vanguard of all the new words that have been integrated. And so, and instead of resisting the change, these dictionary companies are integrating the changes and trying to keep the language flexible. And in a lot of ways, that's what makes a language endure is its flexibility. I would think.
Right. No, I think there's a very strong argument for that. Language that is, I mean, we've hit on this at various points during this episode, but as a language, particularly English language, is able to adapt and bring in words to, within inside the actual language that people speak on an everyday basis, that one probably encourages other people to pick it up at least a little bit more, because now some of their languages are a part of this language, as well as just being more adaptable and flexible and just easier to carry on through, the ages and decades and years and what have you.
I mean, there's all kinds of interesting influences. The role of industry can have a big influence. So the United States develops an automobile industry, right, early on. And some of the terms that arise from that industry are very different from the terms that are used in British English. So we use truck in the United States, and lorry tends to be the more common word that's used in Great Britain.
I've heard that.
Trunk, for where you put your stuff in the back of the car or in the front if you have a VW, is called a boot in British English. The other thing that happened in the United States is that nouns are used as verbs pretty frequently. So interview, pressure, transition, feature, loan, showcase, vacation, all were nouns that started functioning as verbs. So apparently that's one of the hallmarks of the development of the American English language or dialect.
I guess it makes sense if we like vacation, for example. Like it's, be very common for me to say, I'm vacationing in wherever.
That's right.
Vacationing in Hawaii.
You're using it as a verb.
Whereas in Europe, I think they would say, I'm going on holiday.
That's right.
Yep. Interesting.
And so apparently some middle or early English words that are used less often in the UK now are still used in the United States. So fall versus autumn. So you hear fall in the United States more, you hear autumn. Faucet versus tap, diaper versus nappy, candy versus sweets. The use of the word bureau for a chest of drawers or skillet. These are things that are part of an older form of English that didn't gel so well or didn't stick around in contemporary modern British English. American English also is famous for embracing contractions such as can't for cannot, don't for do not, and couldn't for could not. And that's apparently an American thing.
Or shouldn't have.
Or in North America.
Or should not have.
Should not have, right? The Northeast of the United States has apparently more distinct accents and dialects because people have been speaking English there longer, and because it was more closely connected to Britain, where changes in English in Britain were more likely to be adopted. So, I mean, there are certainly dialects throughout the United States, but you can think about the dialect in Maine or the Boston dialect and, the New Yorkese and this kind of stuff, and that this has had a longer time to form than it may have in other parts of the United States.
I mean, that was also the region that was bringing in a lot of these, certainly in the 1800s and early 1900s, a lot of these, European immigrants, which have a lot of different words and a lot of different, dialects of how they speak. I have to imagine that, through New York City and Boston, especially, and as they sort of disperse throughout the entire region, that's probably where we're seeing some of these smaller changes in dialects and just the way things are sounded out, right? I mean, I don't know for sure, but I can sort of see that logic.
That's absolutely the case. And so, for example, from the Dutch, we get the word cookie, and otherwise we'd be eating biscuits for dessert, right? Because and we get changes from French and Spanish we've talked about before. Yiddish and German have given a lot of new vocabulary to American English. And then words that's integrated from African American culture as well, that were common among African Americans, work their way into the broader language overall. So lots of different groups are contributing to what becomes a standardized form of American English. Americans also tend to pronounce R's like they did in the early modern English or the late Elizabethan era. And this is so like the hard R in card or water, which you don't always hear in British English or in some forms of American English.
Right. I think like the Boston accent is notorious for like
super famous for not pronouncing the R's.
Not pronouncing the R's differently. Hawk, the caw, and the cub.
Right. That's the classic example, right? Yeah. This is called roticity, apparently, if I'm pronouncing that right. The pronunciation of an R. So that's the linguistic term that I'll throw out there. And also broad A's, which are more common in older versions of British English. Path instead of path, that kind of thing. So that's as far deep as some of the pronunciations I want to get. But now let's turn the conversation in a slightly different way as we bring it home to the end of the episode here. And I'd like to raise some changes or some variations in English vocabulary that exist in the United States. And there's two sources that I'd like to cite for this. One is Professor Bert Vaux. And Professor Vaux is now a professor of phonology and morphology in the Department of Modern and Medieval Languages at the University of Cambridge. He's from the United States, was trained at Harvard, I think taught at Harvard for a little bit, and conducted something called the Harvard Dialect Survey, which ended, I think, in 2003, but ran for several years. And it's a survey of 122 questions that ask people in the United States how they pronounce certain words and what words they use for certain things, and then where they're from, and then he mapped them. So it's really interesting that you get to see the spatial extent of various expressions and various words. And then more recently, in 2016, a graphics editor from the New York Times named Josh Katz came out with a book called Speaking American, How Y'all Use and You Guys Talk. And it's in the book, it says it was sort of based on what Bert Vaux was doing. And so I drew a bunch of examples from both from Katz and Vaux in order to sort of to bring it home here. And so what I'd like to do is pose some questions to you, Geoff, and then you can tell me. Because we're from different parts of the country. Even though we're both from coast, we're from pretty far apart, right? I'm from
we've established
Central Connecticut, and you're from Los Angeles, right?
Yep. Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And sometimes those things track and sometimes they don't. So my first question to you is, what do you wear on your feet when you're participating in athletic endeavors?
I think broadly, I would say tennis shoe, which I've always thought was a little interesting, a little weird. Like, why do we call it tennis shoe when most of the time we weren't playing tennis?
Tennis isn't involved at all. Yeah. That's right. Well, I'm glad you said that because it holds up with the pattern that I'm supposed to be talking about right now. And that most of the country, tennis shoes is the main example, is the main term that's used.
I've heard sneaker before.
Sneakers is in the Northeast. And so where I'm from, I grew up hearing sneakers. And then I would go to visit my relatives in Minnesota and they would say tennis shoes. And I'd say, but I'm not playing tennis. Or even the older generation, remember back in the 1970s and 80s, my grandparents calling them tennies. I don't know if that's a thing anymore.
That sounds like
Um,
something that would be from like England or even like I know
it sounds a
Australian.
little old timey to
Yeah.
me. Yeah.
hmm
So sneakers, according to Josh Katz, emerged as a term in Boston in the late 1800s. Now, having said that, there are sneakerheads, but I've never heard of tennis shoe heads, right? So
That's true.
that part of it. I'm not.
It's a,
Does that mean it started in the Northeast? Maybe not necessarily.
or
And
it's
then
just cooler, you
there's
know?
an there is. I think it's. I mean, again,
It is.
immediately the regional pride starts to come up here. It's like, oh, I say this, so this is what's the best. It doesn't take long for that to feel some pride with some of these expressions. Apparently, in Chicago and Cincinnati, according to this research, gym shoes are used somewhat frequently.
All right.
And parts of California, running shoes, maybe, and then just shoes in Hawaii, apparently. Not everybody, but that
Yeah.
you might hear that for this. All right, let's move on to another expression here. When you're selling things that you don't want out in front of your home, what is that called?
Oh, I would say a yard sale.
Okay.
I guess
Yard sale is good.
I've also used garage sale, but I think that
Yep.
I've only ever used garage sale if it was actually coming out of a garage. I don't know if that makes
right.
sense. Yeah.
So very place specific, right?
Yeah. hmm
So you've named the two main terms that are used throughout the country. Garage sales predominant in the Midwest and part of the West, and then yard sales used in part of the Northeast and a good deal of the South and part of the West. Now, this is a fun one for me because I come from a part of the country that uses a term that's only used in Connecticut and Western Massachusetts. And I remember clearly that when we had such a sale, it was a tag sale.
Tag sale.
A tag sale, because you put tags,
on everything.
You put tags on everything, and you weren't selling your garage or your yard, right? So the idea is that you weren't selling tags, I guess, either. But this is a very Connecticut-centric term. Apparently, in Southeast Wisconsin, it's a rummage sale, and rummage enters English from French in the 16th century, which is a term that was the word for an arrangement of cargo or something like that. And then apparently in New York City, lesser known term that's sometimes used in parts of New Jersey as well, a stoop sale, because a stoop are the front steps or something.
Front steps, yeah.
And stoop comes from a Dutch word, which is not surprising. This harkens back to the New Amsterdam conversation we had in a previous episode, meaning either a flight of stairs or a small porch with places to sit. And so the stoop is very prominent just in New York as this interface between public and private space.
Mm.
So, that's a lesser known term, but there it is. What about when you throw something away, where do you put it?
Oh, trash can.
Trash can. Okay.
Yeah.
So the trash can is the more common expression in the southern half of the country, but in much of New England, and then through the northern part. And this holds up because you're not from the South, but you're from the southern part of California is more south than north, I guess. And that garbage can is more common across the north part of that. Trash can.
I would say it's. I guess the way it breaks out in my head is like the trash can is what you have inside your home.
Okay.
And the garbage can is like it's like what you roll out to the street, or it's like it's on the street. It's like something that's like outside.
So there's a nuance in what size of the container and where it's located. Apparently, trash can has been steadily increasing in use since the 1950s. So we might get to a point where garbage can is used less, or garbage bin, right? That's the thing that we roll out there. What about when you refer to a group of people, like more than one person? How do you refer to those people? What expression do you use?
How's it going, guys?
Right,
everybody's guys,
right? You guys, right? That most of the country
Very
outside of the South uses that, right?
Okay.
So and y'all. Y''ALL predominates in most, but not all of the South, and which is kind of a cool term actually, because it's not gender specific.
It's true.
But there's another one here. There's y'all, which is likely to be heard in or near Kentucky, which is a slightly different than y'all.
I have a friend from
have you
Pittsburgh.
heard this? Do you know what they say in Pittsburgh?
Yes, I have a friend from Pittsburgh, and she told me once. She said, I think it was like yins or yuns.
It's yins. That's right. Yeah. Which I think is awesome because I don't hear it that much. And whenever I talk about this in a class for the next 20 minutes, I'll refer to the rest of the class as yins, but then I retreat back to one of these other expressions. There's also use or use with a with an E or not, which is you're most likely to hear in South Jersey or Eastern Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Not quite as common as some of these other ones. Or let me give you another one.
All right.
What do you call that sandwich with cold cuts and cheese that's on a long piece of bread? What do you call that thing?
Oh, like a sub sandwich?
A sub.
Yeah,
right?
sub. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is the standard term throughout apparently 82% of the country. This is based on one particular statistic from one of these books here. Around Philadelphia and South Jersey, it's a hoagie. In New York, in New York, but especially Long Island, it's a hero. But my favorite, once again, and I haven't only cherry picked things where Connecticut says things differently, but in Connecticut and Rhode Island and Western Massachusetts, and to some degree, some of the other parts of New England, it's a grinder.
Oh, I've heard grinder before.
And that's what I grew up with, with the grinder. In Maine, apparently, it's an Italian sandwich.
Oh, interesting. So they
which in Connecticut growing up was usually was a meatball sandwich with like hot, with a red sauce, a hot sauce on it, something.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, that's the sub hoagie hero grinder Italian sandwich, or po' boy, which I'm not sure it's exactly equivalent, which is more of a Southern expression.
Yeah, I would liken that to like maybe like New Orleans or something.
That's right.
In my head, I don't know if that's correct, but
we got time for a few more, right?
Yeah, let's keep them coming.
Let's keep them going. All right. Here's one that I think is really situates you when you're using.
Oh, good, because I've been very basic up till this point.
Right. What do you call a sweetened carbonated beverage?
Oh, that's got to be a soda.
Right. Soda. Yeah. Now, so in the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic states, some of Milwaukee around Wisconsin, much of Arkansas, mid and southern Illinois, and a good deal of the West, markedly in California and Nevada, it's a soda. Right?
Yeah.
But if you're from the Midwest, what is it?
It's got to be pop.
It's pop. That's right. Now, if you're from the South, and I'm thinking particularly around Atlanta, what is it?
Oh, I think somebody told me that everything's a Coke down there.
It's a Coke, right? Because that's where Coca-Cola is from. Apparently, parts of the South also use Coca-Cola. That's the way I saw it written. Apparently, tonic was used, I think, in Boston or someplace for a while, but I think that's sort of phased out. It's interesting that Pacific Northwest, where we're broadcasting from, there's a pretty big mix between soda and pop. Probably has to do with people migrating from either the pop belt or the soda belt of the country. But Oklahoma is the most conflicted state in this regard. It's vocabulary chaos where soda, pop, and Coke are all used very frequently.
Oh, that's interesting.
Let's see. What's the term that you use for shredded cabbage that you add mayonnaise to?
Oh, I know what this is. You can get it at like KFC. Oh, coleslaw.
Coleslaw.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Now that's used in most of the country outside of the South, where it's called simply slaw.
Okay.
And North Carolina apparently is the epicenter of the term slaw. Incidentally, coleslaw comes from two Dutch words, kool, meaning cabbage, and sla, S-L-A, meaning salad. So there's another variation that we sometimes see between part of the southern part of the United States and much of the rest of the United States. All right, what about this one? I'm interested in what you're going to say based on where you're from. What about the big truck that carries stuff from one side of the country to the other?
Oh, I would call that a semi.
Semi. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. This is matching up with what people from California say. So a semi or semi truck is widespread in the country, particularly the West, the Midwest, the Southwest, and Florida. It's interesting that Florida sometimes, which is not technically part of the South, actually, and this is maybe debatable, but a lot of times coincides with other regions for terms because people are probably migrating from, let's say, the Northeast, something like that. In parts of the South, namely Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Eastern Texas, it's a 18-wheeler, which I've heard a bunch of times.
I've heard
before.
I've heard 18-wheeler, yeah.
Where I'm from in the Northeast and also the Mid-Atlantic and some parts of the South, by which I mean Virginia and West Virginia, it's a tractor trailer.
Tractor trailer. Okay.
Yeah. I think I remember hearing that.
I've also heard of one other, which I almost said as well, which is big rig.
Lay it on me.
Well, I mean, I don't know where it comes from.
Yeah. Sacramento, San Francisco, and Los Angeles.
Big rig?
Yeah. Right. So that makes sense. Maybe that you've heard it. Other than that,
I was
yeah.
going back and forth between both of them, and I was like, semi was probably what I would say, like right off the bat. But big rig is something I've heard a lot.
Apparently, this is called a transport truck in Canada and an articulated lorry in Ireland and the UK.
Wow, that's a word.
Right. All right, I just got a few more for you.
Okay.
And this is an interesting one because the number one response throughout the country for these surveys that were done was, I have no word for this. What do you call a place that you can drive your car up to and receive alcohol through the window?
Oh, yeah. So
because we didn't have these.
We actually had this. There were some places in LA that was sort of similar to this, and what we would just call them is the liquor store.
Right.
But that would also be sort of analogous with a place you would walk into and get it. But like they were kind of one and the same. So we would probably call that the liquor store.
So apparently there's some real specific terms for this, particularly in the South, that in and around Virginia and North Carolina, it's called a brew through.
Brew through.
and then in parts of Texas and Mississippi, it's called a beer barn.
Oh, that's cute.
Then lesser usage in parts of Texas, there's alternatively party barn and beverage barn. So if you're from Texas, you probably are much more up to speed on where these nuances are used. But it's interesting that you say liquor store, because once again, I'm going to throw in what I think is a Southern New England, maybe even a Connecticut expression. If you go to buy, alcohol, you go to a package store.
Oh, interesting.
A package store. Yeah.
A package store.
And that's, I think
that'd be UPS for me.
That's right. That we'd be getting different things if we went to the package store. Let's see. Do we have one more? That was a pretty good one to end on, but I feel like we should do one more since I just brought it up. How about, there's a holiday where there's a furry animal that comes out of the ground and predicts whether there's going to be winter or not for 6 weeks longer. Yeah. What do you call that?
It's a Groundhog's Day.
That's right. That's right. I think, and groundhog is in most of the country. We do have in the upper Midwest, New England, New York State, this is called a woodchuck. Mm-hmm. There's a rhyme. There's a tongue twister.
Oh yeah. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
Right. So people know it because of that. Incidentally, Groundhog's Day, and I think it would be very interesting for us to do an episode on holidays at some point. Anyways, Groundhog's Day developed from an old Christian tradition called Candlemas, which was brought to the U.S. by German immigrants to Pennsylvania. And I think that's where the groundhog named Phil, I think, lives somewhere in eastern Pennsylvania and predicts whether winter is going to endure or not.
Yeah, he lives in Punxsutawney. And I know that because I just watched Groundhog Day like 3 weeks ago. Classic movie.
So you're up to speed.
I'm up to speed.
Well, I mean, there's so many more of these, and this is just a little smattering. But the idea is, and perhaps listener, as you hear these terms, you start to glom on to certain ones that give you a little smile because that's what you grew up saying, and that's what you know, and it relates to where you're from, and this relates to the very specific, place identity from this language that emerged from this Proto-Indo-European language that covers many different languages today, and then moved from northern continental Europe to what is now Great Britain, and underwent massive changes, and then moved to North America, and the changes continue to this day. And so I think that's what we have to say about geography as the English language for this episode.
Awesome episode. Loved it. All right, Hunter kicks off with our pluggables then.
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm also co-author with David Banas of two cultural atlases, Portlandness, a cultural atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a cultural atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle.
Yeah, and my name is Geoff Gibson. I run a YouTube channel called Geography by Geoff, and of course, I'm also the co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. Find us there, or you can also find us on our Substack page at geographyiseverything.substack.com, where we do extra geography things for you. So just before we head out, if you like today's episode, you thought it was really fun, please give us a rating, a review, thumbs up, 5-star, what have you, whatever, on whatever app you're using. I know Apple Podcasts has that. I know other podcast apps have that. We would really appreciate that. And then, yeah, I guess with that, we can probably just close out. So have a good one.
We'll see you next week.